So, if you played Jack the Ripper, you know that the fear mechanic is basically Jack the Ripper's continuation of the skill tree with a bit more overt skills, we'll say. You get this new ability to terrorize your enemies using bombs and these things called, well, they are spikes, but they change depending on which character you're using them with. And you also use brutal takedowns to terrify people. And it's really interesting because in all of this, you have a parallel and a contrast between Jack the Ripper and Eevee Fry, whereas they both use the fear tactics and they both work essentially the same. Jacks are all lethal. Like, when you do a brutal takedown, you stab a guy multiple times. It's actually longer when you do a brutal takedown as Jack, and there's more to it. And so you have these really brutal, like, multiple stab wound death things, whereas with Eevee you have a couple punches and the use of this powder to, I believe, make them hallucinate, going off of its effects on Eevee later in the story. But what I want to focus on immediately is actually the non-lethal aspect of it with Eevee specifically, because it's revealed pretty early on that this fear technique, as it's referred to, is something that the Indian assassins developed. And having just read Underworld, this is pretty early on in the book, so I don't think it's that spoilery, but the Indian branch of assassins is very kind of... They're almost medieval. They're a lot less progressive than the London assassins. In fact, one of the big issues in the book is that Henry is a character that really doesn't want to kill people. And he is actually shunned from the Indian branch of assassins because he couldn't kill someone he was supposed to. So it seems weird to me that they developed this non-lethal method. And I think possibly where the non-lethal method comes from is when Eevee and Henry return to India. Henry especially being a person that doesn't want to kill people, and Eevee being a very strong person who can get people to do what she wants. It seems likely to me that on their return, they had a hand in creating this much more this non-lethal method that would be much more in line with Henry's own style of assassinship.
Yeah, I agree. Although I didn't read Underworld, I think some of the Batman parallels of using fear instead of lethality are good. But between Eevee and Jack the Ripper and how they use their fear items, the takedowns, the bombs, and the spikes, there's a key difference being that Jack the Ripper straight up murders people, but Eevee does not. When Eevee uses her fear techniques, it's all with the powder and the little screaming noise it makes. It's not a little screaming noise, it's a big screaming noise. But Eevee's things are all creating something that looks like more than it is to make up for the fact that she's not actually killing people. So it's all about getting into the other person's mind and trying to make them freak out more than what's actually going on. This is very different from Jack, who will take a spike, stab you through their hand and then into your chest, and then let everyone see that you just totally skewered this man, and then they're all going to run away because they're terrified of what will physically happen to them. So it's two very different types of fear, which I thought was really cool. It's not just, they're both doing the same thing. They have their own takes on how you use fear as a weapon. Jack's fear is very physical, and, I'm afraid of what will happen to me because I saw that guy get mangled. With Eevee, it is a very different beast entirely. And I liked the way that it was handled with that.
At first, when I was playing it, or perhaps I think I saw a stream of Jack the Ripper first, I was a bit taken aback because they're like, oh, Eevee's been learning some things in India and she's become kind of non-lethal. And I'm like, what? A non-lethal assassin? That's like an oxymoron if I've ever heard one. But I was thinking about it. I'm like, maybe India was Eevee's Nanda Parbat, and she's basically Batman now. Maybe non-lethality is an evolution of stealth. She doesn't want to get into as much fights. Maybe that's an evolution of it. It'd be interesting. I don't know if Underworld would get into that more, but maybe it's like she's been married to Henry Green all this time. He's not into killing, and maybe they've kind of influenced each other. So it's an interesting development.
Yeah, I think there's nothing more brilliant in a video game than when you have gameplay mechanics that actually tie in and synchronize with the storytelling and the themes of a game. And it's really simple to notice just how well Jack the Ripper does that. The fear mechanic is front and center, and fear as a device in the story is also front and center. It's one of the game's overarching themes. Can Eevee use fear as a weapon without succumbing to it herself? Can she use terror to her advantage without becoming a monster in her own right? And that's something that she kind of struggles with throughout the story, because you have Jack doing these terrible, terrible things, and she's hunting him down, she's chasing him, and she's being exposed to all of the horror and violence and destruction. And also, in some cases, using that to her advantage. And the question that she has to face and the struggle that she has throughout the story is how can she win against an agent of terror by using terror herself. And the fear mechanics did a really good job of taking that story idea and putting it right there in the gameplay where the player is going to use it and choose to use it autonomously. When you are throwing a fear bomb, you are making that connection to the player character. And I think that that's really effective. And the other example of that, as you guys just discussed, is the whole lethality versus non-lethality. It took me a little while to notice that whenever you kill somebody in the combat of the game, you don't kill them, you just knock them out. They're still lying on the ground, kind of, struggling. They're like unconscious almost. They're still alive. And that was a really interesting change of pace, because if you are, that guy who's playing the game, you can still go around and just hidden blade to the chest everybody once they're already on the ground. But giving you the option to remain non-lethal in the way that Eevee would was a pretty brilliant way of using the gameplay to foster that connection to the character and to the story. I think the DLC did that really well across the board. It's one of its biggest strengths.
Yeah, I think just given that non-lethality with Eevee as the default option goes a long way to establishing her character and a bit how she's changed in the intervening years between the main game and the DLC. Interestingly, I think this feeds back into that point I made earlier, how Jack is a perversion of the assassins proper. And it basically, whereas the Assassin's Creed, like the Creed, frames immoral actions, killing people in a moral context, eliminate one person for the good of many. Jack's Creed kind of removes the moral aspect and is more focused on the ends, and the means are really just the most effective, I guess, in this case. And for Jack, the most effective means, since he's based his stuff on terror, is the most radical and extreme means to an end. So in the effect, we get this thing where Jack really is shown to be this monster, and he uses his monstrosity to effect a control over Whitechapel that rivals, honestly, you can feel Jack's influence in Whitechapel a lot better than you can feel Templar's influence in any other games, I think.
Yeah, and I totally agree with the points that you just made, Connor. I think with the idea of monstrosity, Eevee makes a huge deal about that in the very end of the DLC with the boss fight when she's shouting, "You won't make a monster out of me," while literally at that same moment doing a brutal takedown on Jack, which is sort of monstrous. And Lawson, again, to your greater point that you're making that led us into this, Eevee is having a really hard time in this fight because she is having to take down Jack without becoming him, basically. The Batman themes are overwhelming in this, but I was thinking about how fear is used in this specific fight. They're both, in a way, terrified and terrifying, because think about it. You are either A, Eevee, who is hiding in the darkness as this, terrifying, deathly figures walking around trying to look for you. But on the other hand, if you're playing as Jack, you're walking around while someone is waiting in the darkness to kill you. Both of those are not fun. So I like how they really played with terror and being terrified are both things that can kind of bounce off of each other and sort of play cyclically into being the same thing the whole way through. So that I loved, because I think thematically this DLC is an absolute gem among the entire franchise. While the characters maybe not so much, I think they really hammered on it with the fear mechanic in this game. So I loved it.
I didn't really feel like there was a huge internal conflict with Eevee not trying to become a monster. I think to me, it just felt like she didn't want to be perceived as a monster for being an assassin, and she wanted to preserve the integrity of the assassins in London and make sure that Jack didn't take them over. That's what I thought the conflict was. Perhaps I was missing this whole big thing, but
I think you're right, and I think though a lot of Gregory's statements can be applied not just to Eevee but to the assassins as a whole in this case, especially as the assassins are the much more explicit, the more explicitly perverted entity here. But I do think in the boss fight against Jack, that is probably when Eevee is most stressed, and when, it's her life on the line at that moment. And Jack is this formidable opponent. It took me a couple tries to figure out how to defeat him. So I think in this moment, Eevee, as far as she knows, there's not really an assassin order still out there in London. I think she transplants a lot of this responsibility, even if some of it's, even if Jack did all the stuff, I think she transplants a lot of it onto herself, and the assassins possibly.
So, Katie, to your point about Eevee, the reason I personally felt that there was an internal conflict going on was because of my specific playstyle with this game, which was that even though in the actual events of Syndicate proper, I played Eevee and also mostly Jacob pretty stealthily, with the fear mechanic, I just said stealth be fucked, and basically went in guns blazing, except instead of guns blazing, it's more fear bombs blazing. So I wanted to be seen by as many people as possible. I would jump in with a brutal takedown, toss a fear bomb down on my feet, stab someone with a spike, and just go through and try to get everyone to run away from me. And I played it very much like that because, A, it was fun, but also, B, I wanted to use these new tools and see how they kind of worked into the whole way that Eevee was working her way through this story. So for me, I felt a lot of the conflict because of how I personally was playing, but I can see if you were playing more stealthily, you wouldn't have felt that at all in comparison. But I felt very out of character playing Eevee in this very non-stealthy, kind of loud going in, I want everyone to see what I'm doing and I want everyone to be scared and run away manner, which is very different and sort of like playing with Jack. It feels off in a way, which again is good in this context. But it worked for me with how I was playing it. It all thematically fit in very well to the overarching ideas I was getting from it.
And I also think that the dialogue, the lines she says about, don't make a monster out of me. I think there are several instances of her basically going, how am I going to do this without becoming just as bad as he is, right? So I don't think I think there is an internal conflict there, but I will probably concede that, like many other parts of this story in this DLC, it's very held back by whatever limits or requirements were placed on the development. There are a lot of moments just like that one where you can see an attempt at a theme or a characterization or a reveal. You can see it shining through, and it just hasn't. They weren't able to actually execute it in the story in a way that really told you exactly what was happening. But yeah, I agree. I think the existence of the fear weapons is enough to drive home that internal conflict for me. So yeah.
Going off your point about the play styles, Greg, I did try to play stealthily, but I do think the fear mechanic is geared towards being less stealthy. In fact, I found it kind of difficult to play proper stealth as I would have thought of it. I mean, even just going off of, obviously, to pull off a brutal takedown most effectively, you have to get in the middle of a large group of people and then pull off a brutal takedown. And that's often easiest when you're actually in the middle of a fight. At the same time, I found, the spikes are pretty loud. They attract attention, and the same with the bombs. And I found that they were best for stealth when they were fully upgraded, but even then, it's still hard to play as stealthily as you would in the main game, unless you play exactly like you would in the main game. That being said, I really liked the fear mechanic as a gameplay mechanic. I thought it was a lot of fun. It could be a little inconsistent as to what would frighten enemies and what would just scare them a little bit. Personally, I do wish that more of the upgrades just you'd use them and would bring an enemy to full terror. I think the only one... Let's see. I think brutal takedowns always engender full terror, but they can sometimes be a shorter range, and then only the very center of the blast, if you throw a bomb at people, creates full terror. And if they see someone spiked, it's just a little bit of fear. As well, there's an upgrade that makes people nervous if they see a terrified enemy, which possibly should have come about earlier. I felt like that would have been where you could really use the fear mechanic to its fullest. Like, set up a lot of enemies by frightening some few enemies, who then go and spread this sense of unease throughout the crowd, and then when you get to that part of the crowd, then you can just throw them into full terror. But that being said, I think that the idea is great. The execution is almost there. They're just like a couple tweaks that would have made me a little happier.
Brass knuckles seem to be the least Eevee-like weapon to me. When I would play Syndicate, I would usually have Eevee equipped with a cane sword and Jacob with a kukri or brass knuckles. But I think it would have been interesting to see if they could have pulled off the fear mechanic with a stealthy style. Kind of like less overt, more covert. But I guess we'll never know.
Yeah, I can't see any way that would have worked. It doesn't seem like that would have been a very easy thing to do. I think it's definitely part of the fear mechanic. If you want to scare people, you generally want to be pretty loud, obnoxious, and obvious, and big and out there. I don't really see the fear mechanic working super well with a stealthy playthrough, and that's why I didn't really use it very often.
I think there's a counterexample that is the Arkham series, which, enemies get... They don't...
I haven't
you
played
can never
those.
You can never quite cause enemies to run away out of fear, but as you take out more and more goons, and especially doing certain thing like certain types of takedowns will especially like make goons nervous, and they can start firing blindly out of fear. But so a bit more of a ramp up like that might have worked with stealth fear, where it's like you could stealthily make. I don't know. That one's more like a focused on taking them off until one person is absolutely terrified, and I don't know quite how that would translate into Assassin's Creed, but yeah.
The Syndicate AI for the enemies in Syndicate is just so stupid that would never have worked unless they just rebuilt the AI from the ground up, which, I mean, they could totally do that for a future installment, and I would love it.
Well, they say they do that every year, but...
Because the AI needs to be smarter to just, hold up as a stealth game. Right. And I mean, when you have games coming out like Metal Gear Solid 5 that are just, showing you how to do it, you got to just evolve it a little bit. But that's a whole can of worms. I don't want to go off on a big tangent.
Yeah. As far as that goes, I think that's probably due to Assassin's Creed focusing on many different things, whereas like that AI is focused on one of their pillars, which is stealth, whereas they also want to focus on their other two pillars. But yeah. I think it would be interesting to have, because this is a slight tangent, but people say, Assassin's Creed is a stealth game. No, I always played Assassin's Creed to be the badass who murdered everybody, and I'm here and I'm like, I played Assassin's Creed to climb things. But I think going off their three pillars, I think possibly the way to make it work the best, I don't know, this is what I think would make for a decent series and kind of satisfy all of them, is that basically like rotate your strengths each game almost. Like one game you'd have a game focused primarily on stealth. You could have it harder Unity style combat with a greater emphasis on stealth. Then the next year you'd have a really hard combat focused game where you go really in deep depth into improving combat. Whereas in the stealth game, presumably you'd improve the AI a bunch for the stealth, and then the last game you'd put a lot of focus into the gameplay on parkour and using parkour to feed into, especially stealth, I guess, but making a much bigger deal of parkour and then just repeating the cycle. I think that would be, I don't know, that is probably ridiculous from an actual development standpoint, but I think it would make some sort of sense. Like I don't play Call of Duty, but it seems to me like that's kind of what Call of Duty does, is rotates it between several studios, each with their different strengths. And I think that might be a way to approach Assassin's Creed and satisfy everybody who thinks that Assassin's Creed is a different game.
Jack the Ripper was developed by Ubisoft Montpellier. They also developed the Dead Kings DLC. I was just wondering, the fear mechanic kind of seems like an evolution of the fighting the raiders mechanics. Do you think it's an evolution of that, or do you think the fear mechanic was originally intended for Dead Kings? Was it going to be darker, do you think, originally? What do you guys think?
I think that to its extent that it is in Jack the Ripper, I don't think it was ever planned to be in Dead Kings. I think, but I do think that Dead Kings tried out the idea initially. I mean, that's much more focused on take out one guy and then send the rest of the room scrambling. And you kind of get that a little bit in Syndicate. You have leader AI, but they have kind of a radius around them that when you kill them, people in the radius will run away, but that's only usually useful for one or two guards. And I think a Syndicate-based game, it took me a little bit to figure out that that's what it was. Because whereas, in Unity, because in Unity they were kind of putting it forth as a mechanic, like, hey, look at this cool thing. Syndicate, it's kind of under the radar and not talked about. I mean, I think you can possibly find it in one of the tutorials that they work like that, but it's pretty quiet. So I think that Dead Kings probably started, like, it was the first iteration maybe of this idea that they wanted to implement in future games, and they sort of did it lightly in Syndicate, but I do think that they really focused on it more in Dead Kings and expanded it in a way that's not so limited, whereas obviously Dead Kings you have to kill a specific person, and in Jack the Ripper it's a lot more free form, I guess. I mean, there's still specific people who are advantageous to kill first, them being the brutes who are immune to fear, which were really annoying, but so I guess my point is I don't think it was planned, but I do think it's a clear evolution, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I would not make the assumption that they were trying to do the fear mechanic in Dead Kings and then just pushed it off to the next DLC. I think it is exactly what it looks like. They just took a mechanic that they had established in a previous iteration and just tweaked, evolved it, and in my opinion, made it really suit the story of Jack the Ripper. But anyway, we're going to move on to our next segment, which is just a very broad story analysis.